have 50 minutes or so allotted to our panel discussion, which we're going to be filming. And the way it's going to work is this. We have 4 panelists who we chose, and I was nominated by Jim to be to ask the questions. So I prepared 4 questions, and I'm sure with 4 questions and 4 people and 50 minutes, we'll manage to do the math and get through it. If there's time at the end, I'll be happy to throw open the questioning to people in the audience who doubtless will be able to come up with much better questions than the ones that I've prepared. So the topic is the future of interdisciplinary science. And so the first question is this one. So I'll read it out to you.
I see a flaw in the plan already.
Yes. When we go to war, we send children, young men and women, to fight for us. When we do research, we send children, young men and women graduate students, to fight for us. How could we train the next generation of scientists to do interdisciplinary research and not get wounded in the crossfire? And for extra credit, what is a crossfire, and is interdisciplinary research an appropriate topic for children? All right, so Jim, so not to put you on the spot, but
oh, look, this is a really tough question. I've already stated some of my opinions about 2 years ago already in an editorial in Science magazine on just these subjects. And is interdisciplinary research, is it a good thing for children? Well, damn it, it had better be. Okay, because that's where the interesting things happen. But the trouble is that our children also need to know that it's very tough, and it's intrinsically tough to make a profession out of doing that kind of research. And it's not that we're being particularly short-sighted or mean in our institutions. It's a very natural problem that when the resources are scarce, we tend to want to save them for our own kind, and that's the way the funding agencies are forced to behave. I can go into more detail, but I don't have more time. And therefore, somehow, our scientific institutions, our research labs in particular, have to figure out how to adapt to that. I have a few suggestions, but let me go on to the other people.
Go ahead.
Let's let other people say something.
You can always come back. Michael?
So I think I should say here what I say in other contexts where there's a very practical question. I've helped the UTeach program I helped found spread across the country. This isn't quite a research project. We might call it academic engineering, but we strongly recommend that the co-directors already have tenure. When you undertake projects, in my opinion, that begin to span boundaries enough, unless you have secure enough grounding in a field that you're not worried about getting fired for having done what you've done, then it's very difficult to find the strength and resources really to do the job properly. So I regretfully say that you should prepare for interdisciplinary research as a child, but you should wait to really do it full out. You should be a young adult and grounded.
Andrea, thank you.
All right, well, I think that, I guess what I would say, so I've been lucky so far. I think that interdisciplinary research can be a battleground, but intradisciplinary research can also be a battleground. And so we send our children to battle all the time, I'm afraid. I think that the battles that you face at the boundaries of disciplines are certainly different. But so far, I just say that, for example, with the interface with biology, I'm relatively new to it, so I have had 2 students and 2 postdocs go, and their expertise has been valued. So I think biology is much more open than it used to be, so that there is an appreciation for a physics background, and so that expertise has actually been valued so far, even though our ideas were not at all valued. What they had actually done was not necessarily valued, but their expertise was. So it's not necessarily, I think, that bad.
Yeah, so I guess I was one of those children.
Look how it turned out, right?
Yeah, and it worked out okay. That's not to say that there weren't rough things along the way, but I think to get back to the things Jim said at the beginning, nobody sent me. That's just what I wanted to do. And so, you find students who want to do, you find students who are more conservative than the average faculty member at their home institution. You find ones who are much more adventuresome than their mentors. And partly it's our responsibility to respond to that. I mean, we could encourage people to be more adventuresome. We could encourage people to maybe think carefully about their career path, but ultimately it's up to them. And we need to communicate to them what the lay of the land is in our view. That said, I think that when you're working at the interface between traditional disciplines, there are some special responsibilities you have to your students, but also to the science. I mean, the quote from Michael about not losing discipline when you do something interdisciplinary has already come up. So that's a problem. It's also true that if you want to work professionally in a way that has an impact on more than one discipline, you do actually need to know more. And I think that many interdisciplinary teaching programs are essentially active attempts to hide this fact from the students. And I don't think we're doing them a service. I don't think we're doing the enterprise a service by doing that. It's got to be harder to be able to give a seminar in the physics department and a seminar in the biology department than it is to only have to do one of those. And that might mean that getting to the point where you can do both of those comfortably is going to take you a little longer, and you're going to have to live in some intermediate state where you have some gaps. And well, for me, a lot of those gaps got filled when I was a postdoc rather than a student. So yeah, I think it is hard. I think that it's easy it's also easy to overstate it. That some version of this conversation has been happening throughout my entire adult scientific life. And so at some point, this notion of working between disciplines should become normal. It's also true that the boundaries of disciplines themselves move. And, I think it's very important that some portion of what is done at the interface between physics and material science be in the physics department, and some portion of what gets done at the interface between physics and biology happens in the physics department. Obviously, material science and biology are much larger enterprises than the part that physicists have touched. But that doesn't mean that some of it doesn't belong in the home out of which it grew. If we jettison, if physicists get interested in problems that are at the interface with X, and every time that happens we say, that's wonderful, but unfortunately it's not physics, go off, then physics departments will be the size of philosophy departments. This is more or less the philosophy department's position, right? Cartoonishly, and I don't think any of us want that. So part of the health of the enterprise is that we get interested in new problems, and some part of that we keep, right? We don't just keep throwing it away. So a little bit, the answers to these questions are up to us as we grow up. How do we behave in our communities?
So like anyone who's successful in academic work, high school, university, and so on, you all try to answer this question by getting extra credit and not answering the actual question. So let me just come back briefly. All your answers were, of course, very interesting and important, but how do we train the next generation of students to do this? I think, Jim, you had some training ideas that you have in mind. Maybe we could just speak to that just a little bit before we move on to the next question.
Well, I think that number one, of course, the advisors have to be adventuresome and take risks. The other thing that I think, and maybe I'm repeating some ideas, especially of Bill's, is that I think that our institutions and the way we organize the research have to be structured. That the idea of having a physics department with some number of professors, each one having his own specialty and his own research grant, or her own research grant. I'm very serious about that. That isn't what works so well. I think that having institutes with somewhat like the ITP, but other ways, where the responsibility for choosing what research programs are going on, what research programs are available for the students, ought to be decentralized, and that the people who are in charge of those things ought to be the ones that take the risks about what is done there, rather than some program officer at the NSF. So that students grow up in an environment where lots of interesting stuff is being done, and they have a chance to take a look at the other kinds of research that are being done, and just be flexible on their own.
So step one, physics has a core, teach it. Every student learns that disciplinary core. Second of all, student is in an environment where at least every week there's a talk coming from an unexpected direction that presents an idea from another discipline that might trigger a thought. And finally, if the student does wander halfway across campus and meets a faculty member somewhere else and begins working with them, there exists a support structure to allow that to continue, and yet tied back enough to at least one professional community that there's a really definite place they can get a job when they're finished.
Okay, well, I have to say I agree with what's been said so far. I think it's very important to have a very strong core in the discipline. So, I ask my students to, they often TA the graduate level courses in the core of the field to make sure that they get it beyond just being a student. And because my group, half of it is, I would say, on jamming is on the boundary of physics with engineering disciplines, and the other half is on the boundary with biology. I make them talk to each other and work together a lot, and do problems across that boundary in many cases, so that they see actually more than just one boundary. Mm-hmm. And yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So I guess the only thing I would add is that I think the much of the discussion here has been at the level of graduate education, and the personal relationship we have with the PhD students who work with us, and then postdocs and so on. I do think we could do a much better job with our undergraduates. It's amazing how many physics students think that helium is a complex molecule if they follow the traditional physics curriculum, or that molecular hydrogen is complex. It's already too hard. This is different in different places, of course, but there's conservatism in all the disciplines of reinforcing a view of the subject which is not even typical of the discipline as it is practiced today, let alone the question of whether we're hoping to educate people who are going to be doing something interesting 25 years after we're done with them, right? Yes, there's a disciplinary core, but somehow the way in which we present it doesn't do justice to the breadth of things that we all find interesting. And somehow we have to figure out how to fix that, and you can think about different ways. And some of that is about interdisciplinarity, but some of it's also just about modernizing, taking our modern view of the subject and trying to communicate that to people much earlier. One could give lots of examples.
Michael?
Brief addition. The whole discussion, I think we've implicitly assumed that we're preparing people to become professors, but most of our undergraduates and even most of our grad students won't. So a whole extension of this is, how do you prepare people when most of them will really not be like you? And that's a long discussion. I just wanted to raise the matter.
Does anybody in the audience want to add something to this before we move on to the next question? I'm going to move on very quickly, but if somebody has something quick to say, please chime in.
I want to pick up on what Bill said. One's duty as a mentor is to encourage students in what they are good at,
And if they're advisory and exploratory, very good. If they're more conservative, then you have to adapt to that. And I've had postdocs come for whom I've had to simplify the problems and to find what they were usable for. And being of a somewhat exploratory nature myself, I've had postdocs who were going to go into those areas, and we plug in. The other thing I want to say is that you have to get to know the other community, and you have to actually speak to them, and you have to try and publish in their journals and attend their meetings. And beyond, if you don't do that, then I agree with you, Bill, you're not really interdisciplinary. And on the other hand, I do think the strong disciplines are important. And I think as regards training undergraduates, they tend to be overworked anyway. They have to take mathematics if they're going to do physics. I think it's a shame that they don't have to do a little chemistry, because the chemists have to do the physics and the chemistry and the mathematics. And so I would advocate that undergraduate training in physics involve more chemistry, and that will already prepare them if they want to go into biology, because that biology really is next door to chemistry. So I applaud the various things that have been said by the panel, but I do think these three are important.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to move on to the next question. So the question is this: apart from what you are currently working on, what interdisciplinary field or problem excites you as having real potential for theoretical physicists to make a significant advance? So why don't we start at the other end? So Bill, you're not allowed to talk about biophysics.
Yeah. So this is sort of the, if you were starting all over again question,
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by something, something in the social sciences or humanities where there is a digital humanities, but I don't know how grounded that is in theory in the sense that we understand it. There's obviously a lot of interest in big data and the social sciences, but again, I don't know that that's had the injection of theoretical ideas in our sense. On the other hand, there is a socio-physics, but maybe that hasn't connected to the data. So somewhere in that sort of the parts that aren't traditionally the natural sciences, maybe we have to be brave enough to step all the way out and see what happens. But be brave enough to try it, but having our enthusiasm tempered by the quality of the data, which I think is sometimes it's an example of discipline that we sometimes miss. So that would be mine.
Andrea?
Yes, my answer would be a little different, mainly because I'm attracted more by physical phenomena, and so I agree that the tools of physics are really useful in these other fields, but the phenomena are really are not physical phenomena. So I guess I would say earth and environmental sciences. I have often felt that I should learn more, especially about environmental sciences and climate problems. I think there is a lot to be done, and there are, many brave souls going that direction, but I think it hasn't been as big of a movement in physics as there has been towards biology.
What do you think theoretical physics or our physics training could contribute to those fields?
Well, for example, the first thing you read when you start reading about this is how limited our understanding of clouds are, and how does radiation penetrate clouds, and this is the single biggest uncertainty that enters into climate models, for example. So that's one area. Also, very little understanding of melting of glaciers.
Right.
Right? And how does that work?
The albedo.
Yeah, albedo.
Yeah. Michael?
I'll cheat a little bit if I can mention something that I have been working on, but only for 9 months, which is it's basically the question of causality in the social sciences. Actually, a lot of the most important work has been done by people who were trained as physicists, Judah Pearl and Donald Rubin.
Can you say what the problem is, actually?
Yeah, how do you, in a social science context, how do you establish when something causes something else? Do you have to have an experiment? When can you use existing data sets? Are our data sets large enough now that you can bring to bear machine learning algorithms and settle questions that formerly could only be settled or not settled by experimentation? That's a very brief description, and there's both formal and philosophical work to be done. Indeed, philosophers are part of the community. Mentioning something even further afield, it would be thinking through that complex system, which might be the world of 20 years from now, in which growth is no longer possible. What sorts of economic and social systems will accommodate that? I think that's a system complex enough to be worthy of the complex systems community.
So what do you think about causality can be understood by theoretical physicists and answer this, correlation is not equal to causality bumper sticker that we're all used to?
We, as a community, use correlation to establish causality. If you look at a typical way that we establish the validity of theory, it's often through a fingerprint, a matching of some calculation that we did to some experiment, which we say, oh, it surely couldn't have arisen in any other way. How else could I have such a match? Think of all the talks you heard in this whole conference. And yet there was not a single random controlled trial. So we had no science. We don't do science, folks. Who tested our hypothesis? Did we hear the word hypothesis, let alone see a random controlled trial to establish the validity of our results? No. We have a different way of operating, and it's actually really good. So just my where this is coming from was years reflecting on how we have established what we know and what we do as a community, and then comparing that with what I was reading about what you have to do in the social sciences to know anything. Having this jarring disconnect between them, which I was living with, morning to afternoon every day, and then ultimately wanting to resolve it, and concluding that actually being able, in some cases, to apply our methods in these other contexts might actually be really important at a very practical level. So I am into it. It's not entirely for the future, but I think there's plenty to be done.
Last week when we talked about this subject, you made the point that instead of doing random controlled trials, we do highly biased sampling, and that's been responsible for the success.
Well, we do a bunch of stuff. We do highly biased trials. Another thing we do is coarse graining. Coarse graining, if you think about it, is a technique that lets you solve some of the problems that random controlled trials are supposed to solve. So that may not be entirely obvious to you, but I can't make the case without time and visual aids. But anyway, I think we know much more than we do. We don't reflect on what we've learned as physicists very often. We pick it up, we do it. I think it's actually very powerful, and with caution can spread to other places that we hadn't thought it could.
Okay, Jim?
Let me just react to something that Michael just said, that he hasn't heard any kind of serious effort at falsifying our hypotheses. I heard one this morning from Craig Maloney, who in fact had a very clear theory or hypotheses about what was going on in those systems, and he was really beginning to show that he could falsify a bunch of them. And I think that's a very important part of physics, and those of us who are serious scientists know very well that we have to do that, and that unless we do that, we don't know what we're talking about. And the idea that we should transfer some of those ways of thinking about systems to other fields is, I think, very important. In particular, Michael was talking about going all the way out and doing things in sociology or things like that, and trying to understand causality in social systems. And that is a much more difficult problem, but it is one that is very well worth the attention of somebody who's trained as a physicist. Now, my own answer to Nigel's original question, because nobody else was allowed to do it, was to say that I seriously want to do some work, as much as I can, in biological problems, because the idea of applying physical principles, the physical strategy for solving problems, it seems to be very attractive when dealing with this very different world of biological phenomena, where they're extremely complex, where in fact you can't say that there is an absolute natural law, unless you're thinking of law of evolution, that you're going to get exactly optimum or even workable solutions that are going to come out of your scientific physics-based analysis, and that is in fact a part of the thrill of getting into there. Is that what you're going to find, and we're already seeing that in some of the things that people have been talking about, including Bill, that what we're finding is that some biological systems, and I'm also thinking of stuff that Aaron was talking about and that you were, that some biological systems which work in a fuzzy way, but apparently work, and the question is, well, how do we deal with that? So I find that an absolutely fascinating thing to go on to think about.
Michael?
I wanted to clarify something briefly. It's not that we don't have methods to falsify things. In fact, I think our methods to falsify may be the best there are. The knowledge that we develop as a whole in physics is extraordinarily secure. But we don't have the trappings. The words are all different. If you look at discussions of how science is supposed to work, we break most of them, at least on the surface. P-values. I mean, if you look at the formal requirements in other disciplines for what science is supposed to look like, we do it different. And I think the way we do it is actually really good.
So Chairman Mao once said that where the masses go, the leaders will follow. So I'd like to turn this question over to the audience, but not to any of the people in the audience who hold a chair or a postdoc or anything. I'd like to turn this question over to any of the students who are here. I'd like to ask if any of you have some insights on this particular question. So any brave student wants to say something? There's one over there. Somebody who has the microphone, please. Thank you.
So there is a huge...
Can you say who you are, please?
My name is Joji Chaturaj. I'm a postdoc with Emanuela Delgado at Georgetown University. So there is a huge work ongoing in sports science, where you actually predict that one team or how teams are how good. So there are currently working on football soccer team over German Bundesliga and then Spain's, and to find out which factor actually plays a role to be a good team. So it's a money, or how can you parameterize that which team will win and how this. So it's kind of in a good way of betting in some sense. So that's it. Thanks.
Well, probability theory started with trying to understand betting, so that may be a very good interdisciplinary suggestion, and also maybe a way to fund interdisciplinary science. So, and in fact, some of the science is now, of course, being funded by people who are very successful in that, such as the Templeton Foundation and Simons Foundation. Any other students would like to answer to this question? Don't be shy. Okay. Anybody else want to have anything to say before we move on to the next one? Okay. So here's question number 3. It's a quote from Stan Ulam. Ask not what physics can do for biology, ask what biology can do for physics. Discuss. So Andrea, may I start with you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think biology forces us to confront a lot of things that physicists have been able to avoid with the kinds of systems we study. It forces us to confront systems that are far from equilibrium. Often, that's sort of the usual example. But and I think for me, that has actually been a lot of the attraction of biology. That's not necessarily the case for everybody who tries to work at that boundary, but I have often what has been attractive to me is to learn physics that I had not come into contact before, and wouldn't have confronted if it hadn't been for these phenomena.
We'll go this way with periodic boundary conditions. So Michael, you're next.
So when I went to Texas, the center was a Center for Nonlinear Dynamics, and it still has the name, but over time it evolved into the center that was largely devoted to biological physics, particularly experiments in biological physics. And I responded by more or less not working on any of the problems that were increasingly surrounding me, with some rare exceptions. So I think this question is implying that the dominant interdisciplinary thrust of physics these days is biological, and I think that is empirically true, but to some extent this always seemed to me a reflection of a certain sort of herd mentality in which it was people wanting to be interdisciplinary, but wanting to make sure there were enough others like them that they weren't going to get too lonely too fast. That's my reaction to the question. I'm actually evading it and not answering it completely, but I think there's much more to the interdisciplinary world that physics can interact with than biology.
But do you think biology can do anything for physics? Or do you think we're just basically being biologists with better math skills?
I think there are many individual problems, including some presented at this conference, which make a case for beautiful biologically inspired physics. And they speak for themselves. I don't know if they make a case for the whole of biology doing something for physics. They certainly make a case for some biological problems being beautiful when analyzed by physicists.
So Jim?
Well, I think what Nigel is asking is, what can biology do for physics in the sense of what strategies, what intellectual strategies can biological systems tell us that we ought to be thinking about? It's not just that biology is going to provide us a whole fields of places where we can do our ordinary statistical mechanics or many-body theories. I think that biology is probably going to show us that there are a lot of kinds of problems that need to be dealt with that aren't quite within the framework that we're used to, and that we're going to have to think a bit more broadly about what kinds of results we have to look for. There's another side of that occurs to me. One of my slightly junior colleagues who couldn't make it to this meeting was Gene Carlson, and Charles is going to talk about some work that he's done jointly with me and Gene. But Gene has been the epitome of going off in maybe too many directions. She's has students and postdocs working in neural networks. She has students and postdocs working in optimizing systems for response to catastrophes. Just a whole bunch of things that you wouldn't think of ordinarily as being things that would go on in a physics department. And she's had her problems doing that. But I think that's a very worthwhile kind of activity, and we need to have more people with the guts to go off and do those things.
Okay, Bill?
Yeah, let me make a couple of short points. So one is that in thinking about the boundary between physics and biology, I think it's very important that as physicists we learn enough about the phenomena that we can decide for ourselves what's interesting. I think, to give but one example, Jim's talk yesterday, obviously the phenomena are phenomena that have been traditionally studied by people in metallurgy, material science, and so on. But, he doesn't need the metallurgist's permission to work on these things. Okay? There's a certain amount of language that surrounds the interface between physics and biology in which the biologists are the arbiters of what is relevant, and we somehow only can work on the questions that they deem to be to be acceptable. And I think, frankly, that's then reinforced by a certain kind of physicist who wants to work in this interface, perhaps because they'll have plenty of company, without actually engaging deeply with the phenomena. And it's not something that we would do in other areas. Certainly, we wouldn't expect to do it productively in other areas. And so I think that whenever, I mean, maybe this is a point that Michael was making, when you cross a disciplinary boundary, go over there and find out what's going on. But then, importantly, decide for yourself what you think about it. Just because you go learn about it doesn't mean you have to buy their view of all the questions. I think faced with the same phenomena, people who come from the intellectual tradition of physics and the intellectual tradition of biology are going to ask different questions, and that's good, right? We don't want to stamp that out in favor of some homogeneous and polite interdisciplinarity with no conflict. I think the other thing to say is that maybe one way to put it is, anthropic reasoning is dangerous in particle physics, but it might be very well suited to biological physics. That is to say, it is not true that organisms are generic examples of the things that they could be, right? If you make a random polymer of amino acids, they clump up and precipitate out of the test tube. They don't fold into being functional proteins. And one can go on at every layer of organization. There's something special about how all these things get put together. And in most of our interaction with the physical world, we are very suspicious of arguments in which our understanding hinges on everything having been put together in a very special way, and that suspicion has served us very well for centuries. But, the things that are alive have been selected, and they've been selected for, a billion years. And so we should expect to see things that are not the generic case that we're used to. The things that somehow have occupied our attention in the phase space of possibilities are not going to be the things that are represented in biological systems. And indeed, you could say that the fundamental problem at the interface between physics and biology, which, none of us is quite brave enough to say is our research program, is, answer Schrödinger's question, what is life? When we see materials that behave in unusual ways, so my friend and colleague Albert Liebschuber once made the observation that when somebody puts a dewar of helium on the table in front of you and you see it crawl up the sides and leave the container, you don't need to read a textbook to tell you that this would be worth thinking about. And saying what's going on there in some meaningful way, what is it about that fluid that allows that to happen? That's an obviously interesting problem. We're used to the idea that qualitatively striking phenomena should have deep theoretical explanations. Life abounds in qualitatively striking phenomena.
So I'd like to just add to your answer. So you said that nobody has a research program would dare to say that this is their research program to understand that, but actually I do. So I have a NASA Astrobiology Institute for Universal Biology, which I direct, and actually one of the things we are trying to do is understand what is special about living systems, and the answer is that living systems have the ability to evolve, are defined by their evolvability, and they're able to reprogram themselves as they develop in time, and that ability to be self-referential in the dynamics is what causes the open-ended growth of complexity, which is a very unusual, surprising phenomenon for which we have no real explanation within our understanding of physics, because it's a very different physical system, different system than usual physical systems, where once you know the Hamiltonian, everything else is all set. In biology, that's not the case. The phase space is created as the system expands, and so I think there are my own answer to this question is that there's as you said, there's very fundamental questions of science about matter that is active and evolvable that you don't encounter in physics. Does anybody else want to add anything to this before we go on quickly to the last question? No. Oh, go. Go ahead, Jim.
No, I would just amplify slightly what Jim said.
Take the microphone.
Oh, thank you very much. I've spent the last couple of years thinking precisely about this in the context of MGI, not just because the word genome is in there, but because
MGI is what?
Materials Genome Initiative. Sorry. Because we're trying to do a lot with data. We're trying to do a lot with looking at what the biologists have successfully done to some degree with managing these incredibly complicated systems that they're looking at. And so they've had to bring methods to bear that typically someone doing theoretical physics is somewhat uncomfortable with. And so I've gotten great pleasure out of finally deciding that maybe there were a few things I could learn. That's all I would add.
Okay.
I would like to say that one of the things that strikes me about practical biology is that it's very difficult to find questions which you can answer yes, no, or don't know. And one of the advantages of coming from a physics background and looking at physical chemistry is saying, well, we can actually measure something, and we have a meter, and it gives us this precise answer. And in biology, that's just not the situation, generally speaking. And so if you want to suggest experiments, which to my mind is what science is about, learning from experiments and doing experiments, that one of the biggest difficulties in the areas of biology I've looked at is, well, this ability to not give an answer to a question. And often don't know comes out, and you have to face that when you're approaching it from an interdisciplinary point of view. Even coming from chemistry, there's more you can do, especially with the tools that we've given from physics to chemistry, which even the undergraduates have to learn to use. So I think there's a big difference ultimately in what you can actually do in the experimental world.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to the last question. So this is question 4, and since time is going on, it's multiple choice. So what do you consider to be the biggest barrier to successful impact-making interdisciplinary research? A, getting ideas, B, getting students, C, getting funding, C, getting results, E, getting published, F, getting read, G, getting cited, or H, none of the above. And of course, you get extra credit if you actually justify your answer. So Michael, it's your turn to start first.
Well, I had a different question I wanted to answer, so I want to answer that first. Because this is an invitation to complain, and I don't want to complain, although I could, and probably all of us could. But I said I wanted to mention a time scale, and I think this is my last chance, so I'm going to get it in. I've entered new areas of study, very new for me, numerous times, and at this point I've noticed how long it took, so I just want to report that. So my standard here is spending about an hour a week meeting with people from another discipline and talking to them and just waiting for that point at which it seems I can make a contribution. The time scale appears to be about 1 to 3 years of weekly meetings before the possibility of the first contributions begins to become substantial. And it could be that there's even a 10-year time scale, which I've only reached once, where it's actually possible to generate something substantially new. In other words, have a new idea that's big enough that you create possibilities, really outside of the normal scheme of things. For example, generate funding that didn't even seem to exist at all because you've had an idea that was big enough for that. So all of the things that you see on the board are problems, but none of us let ourselves be deterred by them anyway. And I just wanted to say that about timescales, because for all of you who are thinking of actually doing this, my observation that that's the devotion of time that it takes to begin to start getting serious might be helpful to you.
So your answer is I getting enough time?
I don't call that a barrier. I think you make a decision. This is again, other people might do it more quickly or more slowly, but I think that it might be helpful to know that a lot of time is very important, and an immersion in the thoughts of other people without losing your grounding in your own is really, really essential, and then, if you're lucky, something happens.
Okay, we'll go around this way with periodic boundary conditions. So Andrea, would you be next, please?
Okay, well, I'm going to start by picking up on something that I was going to say before, which is that I think that the intellectual territory of biology is really vast compared to physics. And there are so many phenomena. That's what's so seductive, is that there's so many phenomena, which ultimately are physical phenomena, because these are physical systems that are there to be studied. That means that it's very easy to choose a problem that has never been touched by a physicist before. And in fact, you know, in a way, I think that's also one of the very attractive things about the field. But as a result, then, as theorists, we tend to jump around a lot. It's nice to, I mean, that's one of the advantages of being a theorist, is that you can jump around from one problem to the other, or one idea will suggest another idea. But when that happens in a biological problem, one idea may suggest an idea that involves an entirely different community of biologists, people who would never ever talk to the community that you've been talking to so far. And that means that you have to establish yourself from the beginning all over again with a new community. And that's what takes time and effort to talk to them, read the papers, and really immerse yourself in it so that you can do that credibly and actually say something that is worthwhile and for them, as well as from a physics point of view, and not just idiotic. So
both of those are really getting connected. Both of them said it's not a barrier, but the process involves getting connected, and that's not really on that list.
Exactly.
well, it's related, because without being connected, it's very hard to get published or to get funding.
That's the point. That comes before those.
That's part A. Bill?
Yeah, so I think the sort of time and community building is really important. So for example, in this issue of, if you're going to try to work on different problems that are broadly motivated by biological phenomena, you have the problem that biology itself is enormously fractionated, much more so than we're used to in physics, which we know is fractionated enough, right? On the other hand, if one of the things that is a problem of that is that if you spend all your time talking to the biologists who work on the system that you happen to be thinking about at the moment, then you don't talk to the other physicists who might be thinking about things that are conceptually related but find their illustration in other systems. So I think this issue of community building is really important, and maybe, there's a sort of chicken egg problem. I mean, communities tend to have patrons. So, can you build a community before you have somebody who's willing to pay for the thing that you've drawn the circle around? I don't really know the answer. I still don't know the answer to this, despite having lived through it for quite some time. The things that worked, I'm not sure how they worked, and the things that didn't work, I'm not sure exactly what went wrong. And I think the time issue is important. So one way to think about this that's maybe easier if you haven't crossed a disciplinary boundary, just think about the interaction between theory and experiment. How long do you have to spend talking to your experimental colleague before you understand the essence of what they can measure and can't measure, before you can tell them something that would really motivate them to measure something that they don't quite know how to measure yet? I mean, to go and, yes, I really wish that parameter were a factor of 2 larger, that they can do. But to go measure, maybe, it's not always, sometimes parameters in experiments are already at the edge of what you can do. But, to go do something that really requires building, something that's the duration of a PhD thesis, not an afternoon or a week. That's a long process, and it's a very human process. In English, I don't think we have a better word for it. Collaboration is intimate, right? In the sense that we expose to one another the things we don't know. And to the extent that all the things we've been talking about are collaborative in an essential way, I think that's really important. And it takes time to build those relationships. And any one of these things can go wrong while you're trying to do that. And which is the one that might destroy one particular effort? Of course, if one thing went wrong for you, that's the one that you'll hold up as, if only X, then everything would have worked well. But it might be that it's just that things take time, and the probability that something will go wrong in that time, can approach one if the time takes too long and you're in a slightly less supportive environment than you'd like to have.
So the last panelist, who's going to answer this question is Jim. Jim obviously has had no obvious barriers to either being successful or making an impact in interdisciplinary research. So Jim, this is going to be a test of imagination for you to answer this question.
Not at all. My first remark is that unlike my other panelists here, I'm going to try to answer your question, Nigel. And my answer is that from personal experience, all of the above. Look, certainly getting ideas, you have to get over a certain barrier. I have a strong principle that I haven't had a chance to assert here yet. Namely, I enormously value my right to be wrong. You have to be willing to make mistakes if you're going to get decent ideas. And you have to be willing, of course, then to say, oh, that idea was bullshit. Okay, but and you may need.
You could be wrong and it wasn't bullshit, right?
That's happened too.
That makes your work.
No. But I've decided that ideas were wrong, and then come back a year later and decided, my goodness, why did I kill that one?
Has a shovel for you. If you
Yeah. Okay, but.
I want to pick up on that last thing. It comes up in refereeing and it comes up in public. Well, is this interesting for its own sake, even though that's not the way nature works?
Yeah.
I think that that's the borderline in some senses between a physicist's approach and a biologist's approach.
Yeah.
And we do know that there are examples where you had a crazy theoretical idea that you could get published through the referees in a theoretical physics journal, and that later on, sometimes many years later on, it worked out that there was a system that applied to. And in the biological area, that's a borderline which is very difficult to publish. And one of the merits of the proceedings of this National Academy is that it can publish things that are on the one side and are not necessarily realized in biology. Whereas I think in the biological world, you have to only publish things that you can demonstrate that are there in the biological world, because it's well defined. So there is a point there, Jim, that I wanted to pick up.
So let's see. So Michael interrupted Bill, and Bill interrupted Jim. So let's go back to Jim's.
Okay. I think that it's important that nobody in this room, especially the younger people, underestimate the difficulties that we're facing today. That the fact that we do not have growing resources for supporting research these days has brought about, over a period of 10 or 20 years, an increasingly strong difficulty, increasing sense of competition, which means inevitably an unwillingness to try new things, an unwillingness to try to fight the research grant system, which is, with the refereeing problems, that one person that doesn't understand what you're planning to do is enough to kill your research proposal and you have no recourse. Getting published in a journal that is not in your own field. I've done it a few times, almost invariably without any success in getting anybody to read it there either. The difficulty in what else is on getting read or getting cited, all of those are enormously more higher barriers than I can remember them ever having been, and they, as much as I've had a record of success, that doesn't help at the moment at all. And I'm really very pleased that I've retired. I don't need tenure anymore, and that I don't even need to count at extra numbers of publications. I'm doing what I really want to do scientifically. As long as I keep the wits to do it, which is another question. But look, having said all that, I don't think our community has an option. We have, at the same time, science has never been intellectually more promising, more prosperous than it is at the moment. The wealth of experimental data, the ways that we can see things from the biomolecules, molecule by molecule, to the galaxies being formed at the edge of the universe, the way that we use computers these days, and the way that, despite all of these barriers, many of us, many of you people here, which is what I really appreciate, are being very successful in expanding these boundaries of research. And appreciating what's important to be done and going out and doing it. And so my final way of saying thank you to the organizers of this conference, which was not my idea. I mean, not to say, but that I really, really appreciate they're doing it. If they need to use me as some sort of an example to send these kinds of messages, so be it. So that Nigel and Jim and Michael. Yes, you can use me if you like this way, and I'm delighted to do it, and I thank you very much.
So, and with that inspiring message, I'm going to thank the panelists and thank the audience for their participation.